In this chapter, we are going to be reviewing the actions of the muscles in the muscular system. First of all, muscle actions and interactions. Remember, there are three types of muscles. There are skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscles. We'll be predominantly talking about the skeletal muscles in this chapter, specifically how the muscles interact to bring about movement, the criteria for naming muscles, and the principles of leverage. So, when we look at the actions and the interactions, first of all, it's important to remember that muscles only pull and they never push. What this means is what one muscle does, another muscle is going to undo. So, there's three main functional groups. First of all, there is the prime mover, which is also called the agonist, and that's the major muscle that's responsible for producing a specific movement. The muscle that opposes it is called the antagonist, and it opposes or reverses the particular movement. So the prime mover and the antagonist are located on opposite sides of a joint across which they act. The third functional group is called a synergist, which helps the prime movers, and it adds extra force to the same movement, reduces undesirable or unnecessary movement, one of which of these is called a fixator, and that's a type of synergist that immobilizes the bone or muscle's origin rather than enhancing it, and it gives the prime mover a stable base on which to act. There's an easy way to kind of remember the actions of these muscles based on the side of the body that they're located at. So we're going to make a little chart here, which basically has three columns. And the first column is going to be referring to whether it's the upper limbs or lower limbs. The second column is going to be anterior, and there's going to be three rows. The first row is going to be anterior and posterior, and the second row is going to be upper limbs, and the third row is going to be lower limbs. So if it's the upper limbs we're referring to, those muscles are going to be flexors. For example, remember if we're standing in correct anatomical position, that's going to refer to the biceps brachii as well as the muscles of the forearm. If they're on the opposing side of the body, they would be like the triceps brachii and the extensor muscles of the forearm. Those would be classified as extensors. The nice thing about the lower limbs is it's just the opposite. So if they're on the anterior surface, they are extensors. If they are on the posterior surface, like the hamstring muscles, the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, for example, those are flexors. So that's a nice generalized way to remember their function. But remember, when you describe the function, you also have to include the joint that it's working on, especially for lab. So when we look at this slide and we first look at letter A, which is the muscle that crosses at the anterior side of a joint, it produces flexion. So the example here would be the pectoralis major on the anterior side, and it flexes the arm. So the arm would be the region where it flexes. The opposing muscle of that on the posterior side produces extension, and that would be the latissimus dorsi. When we look at letter C a little further down on this diagram, we see abduction, and that's on the lateral side of the body. This also applies to the lower limbs. So the deltoid muscle is going to produce abduction, which moves the limb away from the body. Whereas the opposite of this would be adduction, and this moves the limbs towards the body. And the muscles for this are on the medial side of the upper limb or the lower limb. On the medial side, they produce adduction. And we have an example of the teres minor here. And the teres minor would be the antagonist to the deltoid muscle. I want to point out specifically that the teres major, sorry if I said teres minor, the teres major is not part of the rotator cuff. So again, it's the teres major, not part of the rotator cuff. We're going to talk about the rotator cuff later, and that will include the teres minor. So when we look at skeletal muscles, we could kind of think of them like functional groups, or I like to think of them like family. So they all work together. The prime mover, remember, is also going to be called the agonist, and it produces one movement. The antagonist is going to produce the opposing movement, and the synergist produces a third movement. So one example of one of these functional groups that you'll need to know is the rotator cuff group. So it's a functional group. And one way to remember that is the sits muscle, beginning at the superior portion of the scapula, which you've already learned is the supraspinatus, and it's directly superior to the scapular spine. Inferior to the scapular spine, we have the infraspinatus. Then we have the teres minor. Remember that the major is not part of the rotator cuff, and the subscapularis. So these four muscles are all parts of the rotator cuff group. The next slide is showing how we name muscles, and there's various characteristics that we use. There is the muscle location, like the temporalis muscle is on the temporal bone. The shape of the muscle is, for example, the deltoid muscle is in a triangle shape. The muscle size is maximus, which means largest. Medius or minimus, which is smaller. Medius is kind of between maximus and minimus. And then longus, which is long. Then the direction of the muscle fibers or fascicles. So we have the rectus muscle, and there's two primary rectus muscles. The first one is the rectus abdominis. Another one is in the quad called the rectus femoris. But there are fibers that run in a straight line. Then there is another muscle called the transversus, which runs at right angles, and the transversus abdominis wraps around our abdomen kind of like a belt. Then there is an oblique muscle. We have the external and the internal obliques. They run at angles to an imaginary defined axis, which essentially is at a diagonal shape like this. We then have another characteristic is the number of origins, like biceps has 2 origins, triceps has 3. The location of attachments. The name is named according to the point of origin and insertion. The origin is usually named first, like the sternocleidomastoid. So the origin would be the sternum and the clavicle. So both of these are the origin, and the insertion is the mastoid process. The quadriceps would be another example of origins where there is 4 origins. And then the last characteristic is muscle action. And that's named for the action they produce, which makes it quite nice. So they extend for example, we have the extensor carpi radius longus. Another example of this would be the extensor digitorum, and we have an extensor digitorum in the fingers as well as the toes. Both of them extend those digits.